somehow I did not expect this. What I mean by that is, despite the fact that I could not stand Kirumi harder than any other character, or any other person in this fanbase could stand Kirumi, I did not expect the audience to vote on a character with a topic left that vague. In the Patreon poll, and by the way, the vote for Mikan was cast after I put out the public poll, so it doesn't count for the purposes of this video, I also listed Peko and Celestia as options with clear visions for where to take their videos. Hyoko and Mikan would focus on their trauma, and how that influenced how they acted and how that played into their personalities in-game, and would make it absolutely obvious that I'm an apologist for both characters. Peko's video would focus on her as a character and dive into her as an independent from Fuyuhiko, and show that she had a lot to offer in her own right. Celestia's video would focus on how delightfully evil she is without becoming completely disgusting, her stage presence and the way she hams it up, and how she's a much better version of Kokichi's character than Kokichi. But Kirumi was the odd one out of this group because I didn't exactly have a clear direction to take her video. She is my ultimate favorite of any Danganronpa media, but even I admit she's not secretly the most important character in the entire franchise, and that the reason I love her is because the entire universe secretly revolves around her. I just think she's really neat. Which kind of posed a problem for an analysis video of my usual nature. It does bug me when people say that she's a bland nothing character because she does have a lot to offer. For one, she's a pretty drastic subversion of her usual character archetype. In contrast to the clumsy maid that's repeatedly sexualized that we see so frequently in anime and gaming to our chagrin, she's probably the least sexualized girl in V3 and is hypercompetent and considered borderline perfect, actually to her annoyance. But yeah, I just think Kirumi is really neat. Please don't place your expectations on me blowing your mind with how important Kirumi is, like I tried with the Akane video. Honestly, character importance is not really a requirement for a favorite character. It wasn't a requirement back in the pre-V3 days of the fandom. You could generally just say you liked a character and people would respect that. Unless it was Haiji Toa, and then you'd be rightfully crucified and left for dead in the Nevada desert while they counted the presidential votes. Nowadays, you kind of have to fight for some ultimate importance to the narrative in order to justify thinking this character is good, or your favorite. And while I'll fight when a character legitimately does have narrative importance, I won't argue when they don't. But I will defend less narratively relevant characters as completely legitimate choices for favorites, and still having worth in their own right. Some of Danganronpa's best characters were ultimately unimportant to the main story, and some of its worst characters were integral to it. My favorites have always been the characters without much narrative importance. Celeste, Ibuki, Seiko from the anime, and indeed Kirumi. Again, this isn't really gonna be like Akane's video, but you clicked on this video, so obviously you do want to hear my thoughts on her. But this will likely be some scattershot observations with a few shorter draws rather than leading up to a larger picture. So yeah, considering I usually do focus on story, this might be a strange place to start. But a character's design can easily make or break a character. In visual media, a character's appearance is the character's first impression, so it's gotta be good. Not necessarily conventional, but do you really think there'd be Kyo stans if his appearance wasn't very attractive? Anyway, a character's appearance is the first impression that they leave on you. I legitimately fell in love with Kirumi the moment I saw her. Like, that's not even an exaggeration. 2016, the first teaser for Danganronpa V3 unveiling the whole cast dropped, and I just latched onto her immediately. I've never gotten so attached to a character this fast, and I think it's because she hit all of my favorite design attributes. I'm a sucker for tall girls, elegant girls, and girls that dress in gothic substyles. As you can see, Kirumi hits all three. She dresses in very Victorian, Edwardian-inspired clothing that is actually not quite Lolita fashion. Quick rant, her clothes aren't Lolita. Lolita, though it comes in many forms, generally all use a large petticoat under your dress to make it poof significantly. Celeste qualifies because emphasis was paid on her looking like a gothic Lolita fashion enthusiast, but Kirumi's skirt isn't as poofy. Her clothes are historically inspired, not Lolita. I'm sure that'll come as interesting to all three people that cared. Anyway, her clothes are likely designed to resemble Victorian European maids despite her being ostensibly and very much undeniably Japanese, but I do think that there's actual purpose behind that decision. Victorian maids historically were less designed to be sexy or whatever the fuck anime does with the majority of its maids, and more designed to be held to pretty strict standards and codes of work for their masters, including a 16-hour workday, 6 days a week, with a half day of work on Sundays. They would be also held to an honesty test in which a penny was hidden around the house and needed to be found during cleaning and given back to the master of the house, or else they would be fired on the spot for either lazy cleaning or dishonesty. For Kirumi to be dressed in clothes that deliberately invoke that image, it shows pretty early just how good she is at her job to be considered an ultimate at that. I will briefly come back to this in a later section, as there is actually more to say on this, but not here. Of course, she isn't a one-to-one of a Victorian maid because she's a 2010s high school student, and as such is still, a teenager. She has a few personalized details such as the spiderwebs on her uniform, as well as her hairstyle. It's kept mostly professional, but the way her hair sweeps up here is just slightly playful, matching up with her personality. She mostly keeps herself incredibly professional and dedicated to her job of serving others, but she still does have a playful edge to herself when she wants to have one. Her design perfectly encapsulates who she is. Sure, it's not flashy and in your face, but I think that suits her character better. It makes sense for her character to not be super flashy, but she still feels very unique. I don't think that this ultimately came to my brain the moment I saw her, but I think it's nice to dig into exactly what makes her design so fantastic and appealing, even if it's just to me personally. Okay. I've done my best to avoid coming back to it, because I've only managed to get through it once in the 4 years I've had V3. But I'm going to have to go back to it. This is going to be a hard time for me, and I hope you'll forgive mistakes that I make. Surely you understand that it's hard to do analysis when I'm virtually knitting a new wardrobe with my tears. But yes, in order to analyze Kirumi properly, I'm going to have to go back to the main game, and back to Trial 2. Kirumi admittedly does not play an exceptionally large role in the story. Once she's gone, the story doesn't really mention her ever again. And that's a really big shame because her motive was indeed probably one of the biggest in the game. It's a neutral motive, neither evil nor good, yet it's hard to find fault with. And indeed, it's a remarkably similar motive to a previous character. In fact, it's a motive presented in the exact same way. Kirumi's motive for killing pulls upon Sayaka Mizuno's motive for killing. Both killed in order to save the people that they held dear. Or Kirumi murdered and Sayaka attempted murder. It's no wonder that Sayaka and Kirumi interact fairly frequently in the Ultimate Talent Development Program mode, at least if you select the right paths in Sayaka's events. I would have liked to see this represented in Kirumi's path as well, but oh well. After all, ultimately, I'm well known as a shameless apologist for both girls. Where the two girls differ is, while Sayaka didn't know the stakes of the class trial and murdered in order to try and get back to her idol group, Kirumi did know the stakes of the class trial, and the people she held dear were the entirety of Japan. This makes her motive hard to find fault with right away. While her motive quickly becomes a trolley dilemma, it still presents an interesting moral quandary. What's more worth saving? 13 of her classmates, or approximately 125 million people? Regardless of where you stand on that moral dilemma, it's hard to argue with Kirumi's decision. Kirumi learned that she was appointed effectively the role of being the de facto Prime Minister of Japan, putting her in charge of the lives of the whole country. To learn that the entire country may be struggling to such a severe degree, as well as learning that it might be the reason everyone is indeed trapped, it makes perfect sense for her to attempt murder to leave and try and save her country. Not only is that a, albeit difficult, rational decision, it's completely rational for someone in her position and for someone who's a teenager in her position. Her decision to murder Ryoma is explained by her herself. He had such a weak will to live that he was effectively looking for any purpose for his life to serve. When he learned that nobody at all was waiting for him on the outside, it shattered any hope he had left. Not only is that a devastating piece of information for anybody to learn, but it creates an incredibly tragic contrast between the two characters. Ryoma is a man with nobody at all waiting for him, and Kirumi is a woman with everyone counting on her. It seems no wonder that she would consider murder and pick Ryoma as her target. And tragically, he senses that she came with murderous intent, and accepts his fate. There's a theory going around that he did in fact realize something to live for in his last moments, but sadly I really don't agree with this theory. I wish I could. But the evidence points to him fighting back as a pure survival response, not any sudden realization of something worth fighting for. Hell, it's my theory that Kirumi might have been the one to hesitate, and he fought back to make her realize she couldn't back down anymore. Now, what Kirumi did with Ryoma's body after this, I really have no idea what the writers were thinking. Having her dispose of the body in this fashion by hijacking Himiko's performance and feeding the body to piranhas is really out of character. If this actually did obscure evidence, I would have been begrudgingly okay with it. But as Nico B pointed out a few years back...
Seriously, Kirumi, if she just left Ryoma in that bathroom, we never would have figured it out.
It created more evidence for her to dispose of the body in this fashion, and that evidence wound up being fatal. The things that she did not only ensured that the body was found much sooner, but I strongly believe were far too pointlessly brutal for Kirumi. That is a big negative, but about my only one with this case from a completely objective standpoint. The next few minutes are going to be more of a personal point and more discussing my own feelings with the trial. I was lucky enough to go into this game blind, save for a single death and a single survivor. But in my 3-day binge of this game, Chapter 2 was probably the most disturbing for me. First off, I had to take a short break at the body reveal because it was so brutal and so not what I was used to that it sent me into outright shock. I don't know, just something about watching someone's flesh eaten right off their bones disturbs me, but not quite enough to let me be able to look away. But getting back into it, the trial proceeded with no real hiccups. I really did admire where the case was going, and it was challenging without being outright frustrating, but the whole time, I had no idea who the culprit was. I knew it wasn't Himiko because that was the survivor I was spoiled for, but I didn't know who it could have been. And continuing, I didn't ever know, until it prompted me to pick a killer. And the description sent a chill down my spine. Almost the perfect crime. I'd been so obsessed with Kirumi that the fact that this was the descriptor made it impossible for me to ignore the possibility. I begged for my conclusion to be incorrect. For the game to tell me, what the fuck? No, it's not. Obviously Kokichi did it. So that I could breathe a sigh of relief. Being wrong would have been so much better. I was granted no such reprieve. Kirumi Tojo was the killer. My absolute worst fear. The rest of the trial was like mercy killing my friend who'd been bitten by a zombie. I desperately wanted to believe that she wasn't the culprit. I desperately wanted to believe her. I only even pressed forward to see the whole game to its completion. If I wasn't curious for the rest of the game, I might have just given up on the whole thing right here. I might have just surrendered so that at least in my playthrough, she was the only victor. And after the trial, things only got worse. The others echoed my thoughts about Kirumi, wishing it were literally anybody else. Kirumi explaining her motive, a final attempt to save her life. I would have given anything to have it work, even if there's other characters here that I absolutely adore. But of course, Kokichi ruins everything by opening his mouth. Everyone votes her to save themselves, and afterwards we see just how desperate Kirumi was to escape. But unlike Celeste, where it was for her own selfish desires and I could tell myself I did the right thing, with Kirumi, I once again didn't get that reprieve. Kirumi was doing it because the lives of many were more important than the lives of a few, talents be completely damned. I couldn't tell myself it was inherently right to kill a character like this I'd grown so attached to. And as the after-trial progresses to execution, we see Kirumi grow only increasingly more desperate. More desperate than any other culprit we've ever seen, and becoming a further and further cry from her composed usual self. We see and feel her utter desperation and that horrid mix of hope and despair. Despair at being caught, and the hope of escaping her execution. And she becomes the only culprit to actively try and escape it. Kirumi's screams here, they're going to haunt me for the rest of my life. I knew it was impossible. I knew she'd never escape. I knew she was as good as dead. And yet, not only are her murder, case, personality shift, especially without brainwashing or twist villainy, and her final moments some of the most brutal and horrific in the series, so is her execution. I actually cannot watch it. I say that about most of the executions, but Kirumi's is so brutal that I cannot watch it. Not then and not now. And yet, I know it could have been far, far, far more brutal. There's a 1993 2D fighter on the Sega CD called Eternal Champions, and one of the fighters is called Midnight. One of his stage fatalities is disturbingly similar to Kirumi's execution, just much, much gorier. I really advise not looking it up unless you have the stomach for heavy gore. I seriously mean it, this game makes Mortal Kombat 11 look somewhat tame.
Don't let your kids watch it!
My brain winds up conflating the two, which actually kind of makes Kirumi's execution an outright trigger for me. Hence why you'll notice there's no footage for it. I can't handle it at all. And when all was said and done, I was, once again, in a complete and utter shock. I saved and closed the game and didn't touch it for the rest of the day. How Shuichi reacted to Kaede in Chapter 1, I'd reacted to Kirumi in Chapter 2. To later learn that all of this grief was for nothing, that Kirumi was fighting for a country cheering for her, but not because she was their leader, but because she was essentially a tribute in a twisted killing game, it was devastating. It should have been talked about more, both in-game and in the fandom. I actually think it would have been cool if Kirumi was a survivor, since Sayaka was not. I wanted to see a character who had the entire world relying on them learn that that world had already faltered without them. The worst had already come to pass and they were completely powerless to stop it. And then to learn that the world never even cared about them at all. I meant a character that can actually feel empathy. Even if this chapter left no impact on anyone else in the fandom, there's a reason Chapter 2 always causes me to cry and break down. There's a reason I'll never be able to replay it. A feeling of grief like this over something completely fictional only happens once in a lifetime. And it's one of the strongest reasons I don't buy the fiction has no effect on reality crowds nonsense. If fiction had no effect on reality, I wouldn't be mourning a fictional character's death even years after playing the game. And I hope I've managed to convey my feelings accurately. I know many wanted to know my thoughts about V3 too, so there you go. Now we can move on to more pleasant things, and I can remember that the quote-unquote main story isn't real. Good thing! That would have been so painful to bear. Although we will still be discussing bonus content in conjunction with that. So, what's Kirumi like in the bonus modes? Well, it turns out that she's actually incredibly likable and unique here too. She's not as flashy as some of the other characters, which can cause her to blend into the background a bit, but she's hardly like Mahiru, where, while likable, she feels like just a woman who walked in on the set from some university. Kirumi actually feels really unique in a more subdued way. But this fandom only values your character if you're loud and obnoxious, so she gets ignored. It's actually really interesting to watch her act professional around her classmates, proving her dedication to her ultimate talent. She genuinely does want the best for all of them, and we see her talent in action quite frequently in both Kaede and Shuichi's events. But one thing I like about the three in conjunction is we not only get to see a character have an impact on Kirumi with Kaede's events, but we see a completely different setup for them when Kirumi actually affects Shuichi's events. That doesn't happen particularly often, where a side character changes the main character, and especially a character that gets shafted into the background as much as Kirumi. With Kaede's events, we essentially see Kaede predict Kirumi's future. Everyone was going to get complacent with her and start taking her for granted, to the point of calling her mom, which we quickly learn she actively despises. I actually find fans that call her mom kind of annoying for that reason, and while I am kind of a hypocrite since I played pretty heavily with the baby gangster memes for her dad Fuyuhiko, I'm kind of growing tired of those two for pretty much the opposite reasons. While baby gangster memes tend to infantilize Fuyuhiko, mommy Kirumi memes tend to age her up considerably, and I actually think that's much worse. Not only is it insinuating a teenager is about a decade older than she actually is, but it implies her job, something that she's been shown to take immeasurable amounts of pride in, is just doing your average wife and mother duties and that there's nothing more to it. Of course that would annoy someone like Kirumi. She already feels alienated from her classmates by her profession, but now her profession is being belittled and she herself is being treated as though she's a decade older than everybody. Not only that, but remember when I was talking about how Kirumi's design echoes Victorian-era maids? If a maid fell sick or injured, or more relevantly, elderly or pregnant, they would be fired and replaced. Which, I think you can see where I'm going here. Kaede's insight allows Kirumi to reevaluate her principles of selfless devotion, and indeed, while remaining selfless, not letting herself become the class doormat. As for Shuichi, she pulls a pretty big Uno reverse card on the usual protagonist affair in free time events, and instead she changes him and informs him on how he can be better. Especially in the second free time event, where she says she sees potential in him to become much stronger than he is. Only one of the three options here results in Kirumi complimenting Shuichi's assertiveness rather than telling him he's way too hard on himself. As Kirumi gets more comfortable around Shuichi, she begins revealing more of her own personal opinions in her own Kirumi way. Which is actually a quite creative way to characterize someone like her getting closer to others. At the start, Kirumi's presenting herself as she would to any employer, simply doting upon them and fulfilling their request. By the end, she and Shuichi are pretty much on equal ground, and she's even comfortable joking around with him. Of course, Kirumi's free time events aren't completely devoid of her own self-reflection, and getting far enough into them reveals that she made plenty of mistakes throughout her career as a maid, doting upon someone far too much and winding up turning them completely dependent on her to even make basic decisions. She's performed some stunning acts of human ingenuity in many fields. But ultimately, despite everyone's words, she isn't perfect. She's not the superhuman that everyone thinks she is, and she's very aware of it. She doesn't despise that she isn't the superhuman that everyone says she is, but that everyone does in fact call her completely flawless, or even likening her to a machine, or as said before, a mother. And one of her more arbitrary flaws, the inability to cut cognac, also shows that she does in fact have insecurities. She really isn't a perfect maid machine, she's a high school student. It's the one flaw that gets spoon-fed to the player, if they already spend enough time with Kirumi to get to the fourth event, but it tips the player off that there's definitely more flaws beneath the surface. Again, while I believe that this level of violence is far too brutal for Kirumi, it shows that she, someone who just seemed to have an arbitrary flaw, had much deeper flaws as a person. The ability to succumb to the killing game's pull and kill someone, even if for an honorable, albeit tragic motive. It also ties off with Kirumi's fears of being forgotten or replaced. Not only does her design echo Victorian-era maids, but she mentions them frequently herself if you talk to her. The Victorian maid is a perfectly exemplary of Kirumi's fears. If the Victorian maid is not perfect, she is thrown out and replaced with nary a second thought. Deep down, Kirumi, despite her professional demeanor, is still indeed a human being. Unlike Peko, however, it's not that she actively believes in her own dehumanization, it's a much more subtle dehumanization. I think the main reason people call Kirumi generic is because they expect characters to be in your face and unique by being loud and colorful, such as with Tenko, who is beautifully written, or Kokichi, who is literally the worst written character in the entire series. Granted, I've always been more of the type to give chances to the characters that are forgotten or despised and be impressed with whatever they actually have to offer. Akane, Kirumi, Angie, Peko, Kyoko, Mikan, they're all characters that I adore in spite of them not being the popular characters due to either being stuck in the background most of the time or because the fandom hates them for one reason or another. I think I've talked about everything to do with Kirumi. Everything I have to say about Kirumi. That's such an adorable line. I can barely finish that sentence. The thing is, I'll never be done talking about Kirumi. I won't ever be done. Not even death will stop me. After death, I'll possess a Ouija board and talk non-stop about Kirumi to the seance medium and ensure that they can't escape her either. There's no end to this at all. There never will be. Even after this video is published, talking about Kirumi will make its way into other videos. There's no hope, no despair, no past, no future, no logic, no emotion, no reality, no fiction. Only Kirumi Tojo. Anyway, there's more to talk about with her Love Across the Universe mode and Ultimate Talent Development Program mode. While there's also the Love Hotel, and it's honestly one of the more wholesome ones, playing with headphones is recommended because despite Buckland's impeccable vocal performance during her trial, her acting in this scene was just weirdly horny for a purely romantic scene. Moving on! Kirumi's Love Across the Universe, or Salmon Mode events, provide more of the friendlier Kirumi you'll have come to know and love, and we even get to know a little bit more about her personal preferences and see some more of her genuine emotions. Not only that, but we get to learn more about Shuichi due to her impeccable observational skills. We also get to see that she's, while incredibly polite, still eventually going to put her foot down if something is really quite off-putting for her. And in the end, she really does see the potential for Shuichi to improve. Her events in the main game portion towards him, they're really unique in the way that both characters had an impact on each other. For most protagonists in most events, we usually see at the end of the FTEs and bonus events, "Thank you, Makoto Jime Aideichi. You've taught me the value of being a insert vague arc here." With Kirumi, we see that while this is still indeed true, Kirumi is confident enough in her skills as a maid to provide Shuichi with advice for himself, and we see how he's changed. We see a lot more confidence from him in telling her that he'd like to see how far he can get on his own. And if you spend a lot of time with Kirumi like I did, it's impossible to argue that none of the confidence was Kirumi's influence. Of course, it still kind of has to line up with his character arc, but even so, it's refreshing to see characters approach learning as equals rather than all being the protagonists doing, especially for a quote-unquote unimportant character. We see Kirumi's principles of selfless devotion and see that they're not at odds with interacting with her classmates on a casual level. It's entirely possible for the two to coexist. As for Kirumi in the Ultimate Talent Development Program, like every other character, we get to see her interact with characters that she might not normally talk to. These events always manage to warm my heart. It's really heartwarming to see Ryoma and Kirumi interact in a setting where one doesn't have to murder the other. It shows that, like a lot of murder-victim combos, without the killing game in the way, lots of them would have been friends. And I think that Ryoma and Kirumi would have been one of the most likely to actually form a friendship. I think that she would see potential in him and seek to help him improve, especially since she's already helped a criminal syndicate in the past and, reformed them into a small businessman. Also, it's just heartwarming to see Kirumi supporting both her classmates and those in other classes, showing Leon how to make crepes, helping Mikan out with the haunted house, and even helping Hifumi be an actual character that people might be able to relate to. I'm an artist, video editor of that, and I think Kirumi's one of the best things in existence, so yeah. It's all just really wholesome. And not only that, but shows that Kirumi also has some of the makings of a Danganronpa protagonist. The want to improve the world around her and provide excellent advice for everyone shows off not only excellent observational skills, but excellence in analysis and coming up with a way to resolve conflicts very quickly. People also call her plain frequently, and while I disagree, honestly, that would make her perfect for a protagonist because, come on, let's look at the first two. They're not exactly devoid of character, but they're kind of plain. Danganronpa 4X coming this autumn. Kirumi never died because if she died, she couldn't be the protagonist. Again, I had no idea where I was going to take this video. There's no ultimate message here. I can't garner some greater meaning behind Kirumi being my favorite character, which, for an analytical channel, can be somewhat of a death sentence. I'm sure everyone expected my favorite character to have some kind of deeper meaning to it, to be a character that was secretly one of the most important characters in the entire series. But no, my favorite didn't really have much story relevance at all. And if you ask me, that's even more impressive. Anyone will make an impression on you if you're stuck with them for 5 to 6 chapters, whether that impression is good or unbelievably bad. But a character that can steal your heart and keep it within a couple of chapters even after the release of the game? Years after the release of the game? That's something special right there, at least for me. It feels weird to have my Kirumi analysis video shoveled out this early into my YouTube career. I've still got plenty planned, plenty that I want to talk about. She feels like she should be the conclusion to a season. But in many ways, she and this video kind of are. So much has changed in my channel since the start of 2020. Before 2020, my videos were nothing but dust in the wind. Now there's an actual audience for them, eager to hear what I thought, even if YouTube started shadow banning them after my mental breakdown. She's the end to the absolutely explosive rise I had in 2020, with all of the ups and downs that I had too. I started producing more videos so I could talk about what I loved. And Kirumi is the epitome of what I love. I don't seek to make you see the same way as me this time. Approaching it from that angle would just inevitably end in failure. Ironically, for a character whose values is selfless devotion, I just seek to justify myself. To explain why I love Kirumi so much. I only hope I've managed to do this video justice, as it's a true labor of my love for her character.